At her mother-in-law's urging, Roxana's husband convinced her to work as a server on a yacht during a business meeting. Just as she began, she was accused of theft. Roxana tapped her fingernails tensely on the table, listening to her husband. She hated arguing with him, but lately, that seemed to be their only way of communicating. "Just listen to me." Donald began to boil over. "I'm not asking for much, just a couple of hours of serving drinks on a yacht. You'll handle it easily." "But you know how uncomfortable I feel around unfamiliar people," his wife responded, determined not to give in. "And here I'd have to serve food at such an important event. I'm bound to stumble and spill something on someone important. You'd be better off hiring a server, I'll only mess it up." "Roxana, these negotiations are too important for me to bring someone off the street," Donald replied a bit more calmly. "You're my wife, the most important person to me, and that's why I'm asking you to do this. You're the only one I trust." Roxana's face showed a true internal struggle. On one hand, as a modest person, she hated being the center of attention, and servers never went unnoticed. Working in the service industry was something she loathed, a memory still vivid from her youth when she had a job at a cafe and dealt with endless customer complaints. She had sworn never to return to that kind of work, and she'd kept that promise, until now. Currently, Roxana worked in a marketing company as a data analyst. She had her own office, where she quietly analyzed consumer trends and sent her findings to the management. She loved the calm, orderly tasks of her job, free from constant interactions with people, as large crowds made her uneasy. But on the other hand, Donald's desperate request tugged at her heart. Their relationship had been strained recently, and this favor might help them reconnect. Her husband's words about trust left her with little room to refuse. "All right, Donald, let's try," Roxana sighed heavily, resigning herself to the discomfort. "Thank you, darling," he beamed, hugging her shoulders. After the conversation, Roxana headed to work for the company's monthly meeting. Her husband stayed in the kitchen, but a few minutes later, his mother joined him. "Did she agree?" Magdalene Phillips asked. "Of course," she agreed, her son replied with satisfaction. "How could it be any other way?" "Good job." That was the right move, she smiled approvingly. Sending her daughter-in-law to serve on the yacht was her idea from the beginning. She had asked her son to persuade Roxana, and he had done just that. Magdalene had little affection for her daughter-in-law, and since the young couple lived with her, Roxana had to endure her difficult personality and try to smooth over constant conflicts. Roxana often ignored these provocations, which only aggravated her hot-tempered mother-in-law. Magdalene considered Roxana a spineless, insignificant mouse who couldn't stand up for herself, so she frequently belittled and insulted her. She also interfered in Roxana and Donald's marriage, attempting to turn her son against his wife. This was why their relationship had become tense in recent months. Roxana kept waiting for the day her husband would stand by her and show support, but he was always absorbed in his work and indifferent to household conflicts and drama. Before they left for the meeting, Donald inspected Roxana's appearance. "It's better if you change your skirt to a black one. You'll look more formal that way," he commanded. "But it's lined," Roxana grimaced. "And it's so hot outside today. I'll overheat in it," she tried to explain her choice. "Roxana, these negotiations are very important," he said in a tone that left no room for argument. "So do as I say." With sadness, Roxana removed her light pink skirt, perfect for summer, and changed into another. And put on red lipstick. Her husband continued his instructions. "I'm afraid it will look too flashy," she shook her head. "Trust me, I know what's appropriate for events like this." Donald frowned, and Roxana had to comply again. They were in for a 3-hour yacht cruise down the river. When Roxana heard how long the event would last, she nearly groaned. Not only would she be wearing a warm skirt and high heels, but she'd also be under the scorching sun for hours. She silently prayed that seasickness, which she couldn't entirely rule out, wouldn't be added to the already challenging situation. They were among the first to board the yacht. Roxana immediately received instructions from the catering organizer and then stepped aside to stay out of the way. The current was calm today, but the sun was already beating down. Gradually, the meeting attendees began arriving. Representatives from the city's largest companies assembled before her eyes. These were true business sharks who had built vast fortunes in their lives. Roxana had to admit that, in comparison, Donald paled. Yes, he owned his own business, but its income was neither stable nor particularly substantial. But she didn't judge him. Her own salary was average. She wasn't used to luxury, as she too had grown up in a modest family. She hadn't gone hungry, but her parents couldn't afford many things, and she had often envied friends who had lots of toys and nice clothes. When the yacht's owner arrived, some guests stepped aside to greet him. At that moment, Donald signaled to Roxana that she should bring champagne. She appeared beside him promptly, graciously offering drinks to everyone. At that moment, they had already set sail, and Roxana realized she was the only woman on board. This realization unsettled her for a few moments. But she wasn't the only one who noticed. "You know, gentlemen, a woman on board is bad luck," one of Donald's business partners remarked, gesturing toward her with a glance. The others burst into laughter. Roxana had no choice but to give them a polite smile. In reality, she felt horrible, especially under the curious stares of the businessmen who weren't shy about sizing her up. It made her uncomfortable, and she just wanted to disappear. "I hope we make it back to shore in one piece," another businessman joined in on the joke. After the men had laughed, enjoyed some small talk, and had a few drinks, they finally moved on to the purpose of their gathering, the negotiations. They left the deck and moved to the largest cabin, where Roxana had to be present in case anyone needed snacks or drinks. She kept glancing at her wristwatch, counting the minutes until the evening would end. She had already endured an hour, but there were 2 more to go. Roxana stifled a deep sigh, trying to maintain a friendly appearance. A businessman she didn't know asked her to bring him some snacks, which she readily did. "Has anyone seen my flash drive?" a silver-haired man in a gray jacket asked anxiously. "It contains all the important documents for my company." Immediately, everyone around began searching for it, as those documents could determine many fates. "Are you sure you brought it with you?" a colleague asked. "Don't make me out to be an idiot." "It was just lying on the edge of the table," the man snapped, casting a glance at everyone around him. His angry gaze lingered on Roxana, who wished she could disappear, just so she wouldn't have to look at him. "You, miss, come over here," he ordered, frowning at her. She had just managed to relax in a corner, but now all eyes were on her again. She covered the few yards with stiff legs and flushed cheeks. "Open your bag." Roxana tried to object, as this was going too far, but her protest was feeble, and her quiet voice was drowned out by the men's bassy voices. "Hurry up and open your bag." "Do I have to repeat myself?" An even less respectful voice came from behind her. With trembling hands, Roxana opened her bag. Of course, she was innocent. She had no use for someone else's flash drive. Yet panic overtook her, making her hands unsteady, and she struggled to unzip the bag. "She's the thief, there's no one else it could be," someone in the crowd sneered. Roxana looked desperately for her husband, silently pleading for him to defend her. But Donald not only failed to support her, he snatched the bag from her trembling hands and emptied its contents onto the floor. That's when the flash drive was found. Whispering started behind her. "I knew it," the aggrieved businessman sneered maliciously. "Who thought hiring a fraud was a good idea?" the yacht's owner grumbled. In the old days, they would have thrown her overboard for this. Roxana felt herself shaking. She didn't understand how the flash drive had ended up in her bag when it had been in her sight the whole time. And why would someone frame her like this? Questions raced through her mind, but they all faded in comparison to the most important one: why did Donald do nothing to protect her? Her husband stood with the others, nodding along energetically as the men ranted about how dangerous it was to trust women these days. "Why are you silent?" Roxana's silent plea screamed as she wrung her hands. She stared at him, waiting for him to say something to clear her name. But he remained silent, which hurt more than the words of the strangers she was seeing for the first, and likely last, time. "Gentlemen, please excuse me," Donald spoke up. "My wife is a kleptomaniac. She's undergoing treatment, but as you can see, the results are poor." Roxana's jaw almost dropped. She was no kleptomaniac. She wanted to object, but her husband grabbed her painfully by the elbow and pulled her closer. "Are you completely stupid?" he said loudly. "Do you know where you are?" The injustice and shock left Roxana speechless for a moment. Her eyes welled up with tears, and her heart ached with sorrow. "Why," she managed to whisper so only he could hear. He glanced at her but said nothing. After this humiliation, Donald took her by the arm and shoved her into a utility room so she wouldn't be a nuisance to anyone. Roxana tried to talk to him, but he quickly left, returning to the meeting. She spent the rest of the evening alone in the cramped room, bent over in tears, waiting for the yacht to finally return to shore. The moment she felt solid ground beneath her feet, Roxana ran as fast as she could from the cursed yacht. She got into the first taxi she saw and gave her home address. Her husband stayed behind to chat with his colleagues, seemingly unfazed by what had just happened to her. When Roxana arrived home, humiliated and hurt, her distress didn't go unnoticed by her mother-in-law, who met her at the door. "What happened to you, and where is Donald?" the older woman asked. Roxana took a deep breath, and everything came pouring out as she emotionally recounted what had happened at the negotiations. By the end of her story, tears were streaming down her face. "I just don't understand why he did this to me," Roxana whispered, wiping her face. Her mother-in-law merely gave an indifferent grunt, patting her on the shoulder as a weak show of support, but there was a smirk on her face that Roxana didn't notice at first. "You'd better go wash up, you look awful," Magdalene remarked bluntly. When Roxana looked in the mirror, she was horrified. Her mascara had smudged all over her tear-streaked face, which was swollen from crying, and her hair was tousled by the wind. She quickly went to the shower, hoping to wash away not just her makeup, but also the sadness that had built up over the evening. Meanwhile, Magdalene's mood only improved. Initially, she'd been upset about her favorite show being canceled that day, but Roxana more than made up for the loss. Magdalene was quite pleased with herself, as she'd been the one who suggested the idea to her son to humiliate Roxana in the first place. As Roxana tried to pull herself together, her husband was still on the yacht. The negotiations had gone quite well, so after bidding farewell to the most important partners, he returned to his colleague. "Thank you, Frederick, it all looked very convincing," Donald said, patting him on the shoulder and handing him a few bills. "Well, if you ever need help again, you know where to find me," his companion chuckled, slipping the money into his pocket. They laughed and disembarked, agreeing to spend a bit more time at a restaurant. As they left, a sailor watched them with a long, contemptuous look. Since that ill-fated night on the yacht, not a single day had passed without Roxana's mother-in-law reminding her of her theft. Whenever they had a misunderstanding or argument, Magdalene would call her a thief, insisting she had no right to talk back. Once, Magdalene misplaced her earrings, only to remember later where she'd left them, but during her search, she couldn't resist taking a jab at her daughter-in-law. "Roxana, maybe they're in your bag," the older woman asked sarcastically. "Magdalene, how can you say such a thing?" Roxana replied indignantly. "I didn't take anything." "Are you sure?" Magdalene squinted. "Knowing your tendencies, I'm not so certain anymore. Now I have to count every penny. Maybe you should show me your bag?" Feeling a sense of déjà vu, Roxana grimaced. The memory of that day on the yacht still stung. She swallowed her irritation and sorrow before fleeing to work. To avoid the tension at home and the constant humiliation from her mother-in-law, she began leaving early and returning late, spending as little time as possible with Magdalene and her sharp tongue. Roxana fought to hold back tears on her way to work, trying not to arrive with smeared makeup. Every day, her mother-in-law seemed to drain her soul, reminding her of the day she wanted more than anything to forget. She was so worn out and broken that she was barely thinking straight. At one point, instead of turning toward her office, she took another path and ended up by the river. Overwhelmed by so many emotions, she longed to escape them and feel nothing. The river's calmness captivated her, though the current here was far from gentle. Each year, it claimed dozens of lives, both children and adults, and a large sign by the shore warned in red letters, "Swimming prohibited." If I go in, everything will finally be okay, a thought flashed in her mind, and Roxana took a step forward. Then another, and another. With each step, she imagined the river embracing her, filling her with peace. When the water reached her knees, and she prepared to plunge and surrender to the current, she suddenly felt two strong hands around her waist, pulling her back to shore. Opening her eyes, she found herself lying on the sand, with a stranger sitting beside her. In horror, she looked toward the water, realizing only now that she had nearly drowned. "Oh, my God," she gasped, covering her face with her hands. The stranger sat silently a few meters away, waiting for her to regain her composure. After a few minutes, Roxana calmed down and looked at her rescuer with curiosity. "Thank you," she said shyly. "It seems you stopped something terrible from happening." "Don't thank me. I couldn't just stand by," he replied, brushing it off. "Do you remember me?" Roxana looked closely at his sun-kissed face, trying to place him, but when she couldn't, she shook her head. "My name is Morgan. I work on the yacht running on waves." "I saw you at that gathering a while back," he said. Hearing about that day made Roxana nervous, something that didn't go unnoticed by her companion. "Oh, no. Please don't think I'm here to shame you. I didn't seek you out for that," the sailor explained. "You were looking for me?" Roxana asked, surprised. He nodded, explaining that he had been trying to find her for several days and, by a fortunate coincidence, had decided to take this route near the river. "I need to tell you something. It concerns your husband." After these words, the man revealed that, while boarding the deck, he had overheard a rather curious conversation involving Donald. He was talking to his associate, arranging for him to first steal their partner's flash drive and then slip it into his wife's belongings while she was serving as a waitress. Donald needed this ploy to present himself as an honest and principled man in his partner's eyes, someone who valued his career above all else, even family, and who would stop at nothing for the sake of truth, even refusing to cover for his own wife. Morgan had wanted to warn her on the deck, but there were too many people around, and he lost his nerve. He had only recently started working on this yacht, and after months of job hunting, he couldn't afford to lose it. Reluctantly, he had to suppress his urge to step forward and defend her. "And ever since that day, my conscience has tormented me. I decided to find you and tell you everything." Better late than never, Morgan concluded his story. He berated himself every day for staying silent because no job was worth behaving like a coward, especially when it came to defending a woman. He despised all the businessmen who had been on the yacht that day. What kind of men were they if they didn't step in for Roxana and allowed her husband to humiliate her? Unlike Morgan, they could have done so without risking anything, yet they chose to remain silent and revel in someone else's shame. Morgan thought Roxana would start crying again, and he was ready to console her. But her reaction surprised him. "That scoundrel," she exclaimed, kicking the sand. "He framed me as a thief just to impress his partner." Anger boiled within her. Roxana felt her fists clenching. If Donald had been anywhere nearby, he wouldn't have gotten off lightly. She'd have gladly scratched that smug look off his face. She began pacing back and forth, thinking intensely about what to do next. "You need to calm down," Morgan said, stepping closer. "The worst thing you could do right now is act impulsively. It's better to plan your actions carefully so you won't regret them later." The steady gaze of his blue eyes had a soothing effect on her, and Roxana sank back down onto the sand. He was right, she needed to think things through before making any decisions. "I don't understand, could his lousy business really be worth putting me through this?" Roxana wondered aloud. Especially after so many years together, after all those words about love. The sailor cleared his throat, drawing her attention. "Is there something else I should know?" Roxana raised an eyebrow. When everyone disembarked, I saw a woman approach your husband, he began delicately. They hugged, kissed, they acted as though they were together. Morgan tried to say this as gently as possible, worrying about Roxana's mental state. After all, she'd been ready to end her life, so anything was possible. Roxana felt a lump form in her throat, but she couldn't cry anymore. She found the strength to swallow it down and avoid breaking into sobs. "No, I won't let this go," Roxana whispered, her voice barely audible. "Donald treated me horribly, and he needs to regret it." Thoughts of revenge gave her strength. She no longer wanted to cry or suffer, feeling helpless and miserable. Roxana wanted to make her unfaithful husband feel the full extent of her pain, to make him suffer as she had. Filled with resolve, she sprang up from the sand. "Thank you, Morgan," she smiled, extending her hand to him. "For everything." "I hope you'll be okay," he replied, looking out toward the river. "Don't worry about that," Roxana said confidently. "I won't harm myself again, and I won't let anyone else harm me either." They were silent for a few minutes and were about to part ways when, unexpectedly, Roxana blurted out, "I hope we'll meet again." "Well, you know where to find me," Morgan winked. That evening, when the small family gathered for dinner, Roxana became the subject of her mother-in-law's taunts once again. Donald remained silent, so nothing changed. Roxana sat there with the same sour expression as in recent days, and no one suspected that she knew about the monstrous deception. She and Donald had never discussed what happened on the yacht. He preferred to act as though nothing had happened, confident that his wife would simply swallow it, as usual, without further complaints. He even ignored his mother's mocking remarks. The next morning, Roxana woke up before everyone else. She waited until her husband left for work, and her mother-in-law went to the market, then she slipped over to Donald's safe. He hadn't bothered much about security, using his own birth date as the code, a combination Roxana knew well, so the safe opened on the first try. Wasting no time, she grabbed all the documents inside and stuffed them into her bag. Realizing she probably wouldn't be returning to this house again, Roxana packed her things and called a friend to ask if she could stay for a few days. Only then did she head to work. During her lunch break, Donald received a call. "Yes, Roxana," he answered, unsuspecting. "What do you want?" "For you to confess to your partners that you stole the flash drive and framed me to win their favor and secure the negotiations for yourself," she replied in a steely voice. Silence fell on the line. He must have fallen off his chair in shock. "What?" was all Donald could say. "Oh, and one more thing. I want you to publicly apologize to me, in front of your partners as well," his wife added. "And to give you some motivation, I'll send you a photo," Roxana said with a smirk and hung up. A few seconds later, a photo of his documents from the safe arrived on Donald's phone. He shot up from his desk, causing his chair to topple over, and immediately called her back. "You've lost your mind," he began shouting. "Do you even understand how important this is?" Donald was furious. Roxana was elated. That was exactly the reaction she had hoped for. "No, I don't understand, but I'm sure your competitors will be glad to help me out. What do you think? Should I deliver these to them now or after lunch?" Roxana replied with a mocking tone. "I bet they'd love such an unexpected gift." "Don't you dare," Donald hissed. "That'll be the last thing you do in this life." "Oh, come on," his wife scoffed. "Your threats are as empty as your so-called business successes, so I have nothing to fear. So, here's the deal, a public apology along with your admission of deception, or your precious documents end up with your competitors. Your choice." And with that, Roxana hung up again. Her voice sounded confident, but her heart clenched and her hands shook. It's not every day you threaten your own husband, she thought. Nevertheless, Roxana was certain she had handled it perfectly. No longer the timid, gray mouse who had been humiliated and stayed silent, now she was a strong woman ready to stand up for herself. It seemed she had needed to be pushed to the edge and trampled on for this strength to awaken. Donald, on the other hand, was ready to tear his hair out in panic. The documents now in his wife's possession could destroy his business in an instant. They contained incriminating information about his company, a true account of its less-than-legal financial activities. That was why he had kept them at home, safe from any prying eyes or random audits that might expose the violations. With no better idea, Donald rushed home to consult his mother. "That witch," Magdalene sneered, shaking her head. "She planned this well. Look at the cabinets, they're empty. While we were gone, your wife cleaned out the safe and packed her things. So what do I do now?" Donald asked, desperate. "I don't know, Donald," the older woman replied with a shrug. "Try to stall for time. Maybe we'll come up with something." Seeing no other way out, Donald reluctantly agreed to his wife's terms, but asked for some time to gather his partners, saying they were all very busy and difficult to bring together. In reality, he had no intention of publicly apologizing. It would be a disgrace that would destroy both his reputation and the business he had worked so hard to build. He even came to her office to search her desk. However, Roxana had anticipated this and hidden the folder in a secure place known only to her. She felt a grim satisfaction, knowing her husband was now going through a tough time, courtesy of her, and was happy about it. She knew she was doing the right thing. Donald had earned it. And it warmed her heart to know that a brave sailor was on her side. One day, Roxana felt the urge to see Morgan again, so she went to the yacht. She remembered that a few days ago, he had planned a short trip but should have returned by now. "Bad news, ma'am," the senior sailor shook his head. "There was an accident. Morgan went overboard." "What? What are you talking about?" she gasped in horror. "Just saying what I saw." "Now go, don't get in the way," the senior sailor finished unkindly. Roxana covered her face with her hands, unwilling to believe it. After a moment, she gathered herself and realized it couldn't be true. Most likely, someone found out that Morgan had helped her, and he was eliminated as an unwanted witness. A man as strong as him couldn't have just fallen overboard, she thought, backing away from the running on waves. She felt guilty, knowing he was targeted because of her, and she didn't know what to do now. How would she find Morgan? At that moment, she realized just how much she cared for him. After he'd saved her, they had met a few more times, and she had to admit she missed him. Nevertheless, Roxana was determined to use her few connections to try to locate him. She had a bad feeling urging her to hurry. Her efforts to find Morgan soon reached her husband's ears. Much to his delight, finally, he had a card up his sleeve as well. One day, he called her. "Have you gathered your partners yet? Ready to apologize?" Roxana asked mockingly. "Is that all you care about?" he replied coldly. "I have a much more interesting proposal. You return my documents, and I'll tell you where the sailor is. Then we can file for divorce and part ways like ships in the night." Donald practically sang the last line. "So, you kidnapped him?" Roxana's usual confidence faltered, and panic crept into her voice. "Well, let's say that's true," Donald replied mockingly. Roxana closed her eyes, realizing she had fallen into his trap. She wanted a public apology and to humiliate her husband in return. But she understood that Morgan's life was far more important than her pride, especially since he had recently saved her life. "Fine, I agree," she exhaled. "Just tell me the time and place, and I'll be there." Donald hung up and rubbed his hands together in anticipation. The truth was, he had no idea where this sailor was or even who he was. But it was a convenient way to pressure his wife and get what he wanted. The next day, Roxana stood before him, holding the documents in her hands. As she handed them over, she knew she was giving up her only leverage against him. "Well, are you satisfied?" she asked in a voice full of hatred. "Now tell me, where is Morgan?" "Morgan?" Donald feigned surprise. "Don't play dumb. We had a deal," Roxana practically hissed, starting to lose her patience. "Oh, Morgan." "I lied," her husband smirked. "I have nothing to do with your sailor's disappearance." "You're lying," Roxana shouted, hitting him in the chest with her fists. Donald managed to push her off, nearly causing her to lose her balance. "Crazy woman," he spat, noticing his shirt was torn. "See you in court next time." With those words, he left her standing alone. Roxana was ready to scream in frustration. Not only had she lost her only leverage over him, but it had all been for nothing, as he deceived her. "I should have known, lying is all he ever does," she thought bitterly. Back at her friend's house, Roxana felt increasingly unwell. She'd been battling nausea for days, and now she was on the verge of fainting. "Should we call an ambulance?" her friend asked worriedly. "Don't worry, Barbara. I'll lie down, and it'll pass as usual," Roxana replied, waving her off. Half an hour later, she did feel better. "See? I told you. It's just nerves," she chuckled. But Barbara had a different opinion and handed her a pregnancy test. Roxana laughed in her face. She and her husband had tried for years to have a child without success. She had come to terms with never being a mother and didn't believe in miracles. So imagine her surprise when the test showed 2 lines. "Oh my God!" Roxana whispered in complete shock, burying her hands in her hair. Why now, of all times? Her emotions were mixed. On one hand, she had waited so long for this child. On the other, her life was falling apart, and she felt anything but prepared. I can't even put my own life in order. How am I supposed to take care of a child? Roxana thought. She had no stable home, her marriage was in shambles, and a difficult divorce loomed. "You should see a doctor first, just in case the test is wrong," her friend wisely suggested, "and then think about your future." But the doctor confirmed the pregnancy. Roxana took a deep breath, placing a hand on her abdomen. The thought of termination never crossed her mind. After all, the baby wasn't to blame for her troubles. She vowed to do everything she could to get her life together and prepare for the baby's arrival. Despite the news of her pregnancy, Roxana didn't stop searching for Morgan. She returned to the yacht, spoke with the other sailors again, and even went to the management. But everyone repeated the same story: he'd fallen overboard and drowned in the river. When Roxana asked where the body was, they told her the current had carried it away. Then why isn't anyone looking for him? Don't they usually call rescuers and divers in these cases? She asked suspiciously. "Ma'am, we don't know anything," was the standard response. Roxana was on the verge of despair when her friend suggested she see a fortune teller. At first, Roxana scoffed at the idea, having never believed in the supernatural and considering such people to be frauds. But with no other options, she decided to give it a try. The fortune teller, an elderly woman named Courtney, was blind in her right eye. "Oh, so the skeptic has come," Courtney remarked as soon as Roxana entered, throwing her off balance. "This must be something important." "Yes, I'm looking for someone," Roxana replied uncertainly. The fortune teller squinted and examined her with her one seeing eye, then abruptly grabbed her hand. "They say he's dead," Courtney said, "but I don't see him in the world of the dead." Hearing this, Roxana finally allowed herself to exhale a little. Deep down, she hadn't wanted to believe that Morgan had drowned. "But if you don't hurry, he may well end up there," the fortune teller continued, and Roxana tensed. "I see an old cabin with a dented roof, a large oak tree beside it. He's there. He has a head wound, and there's blood all around him." The fortune teller said no more. Roxana thanked her fervently, handed her some bills, and rushed off to begin her search. "Wait, child, I have something else to tell you," the fortune teller said, standing up and moving closer, placing a hand on Roxana's abdomen. Roxana stopped. "Take care of your little one. Don't go near the yacht with her," Courtney said. Whatever that meant, Roxana nodded and then left. There were several villages near the city, each with cabins that might resemble the one she was looking for. Roxana was determined to search every one of them. Morgan was likely in serious condition and urgently needed help. She spent several days searching until luck finally smiled on her. Entering a house on the edge of a village, Roxana heard a faint groan. In the next moment, she saw Morgan. A wave of relief washed over her, and she immediately rushed to him. "I'm so happy you're alive," she cried, hugging him tightly. Morgan looked at her with bewildered eyes, showing no recognition. A white bandage covered his head, with a small bruise peeking from beneath it. "Do I know you?" he asked, pulling away in confusion. Now it was her turn to be surprised. Had he lost his memory? Apparently, Roxana was a stranger to him now. "Yes, we're close friends," she said, nearly crying. "It feels like this is the first time I'm seeing you," Morgan replied. At that moment, a woman entered the room to change his bandage. She was the one who had found him in a terrible state, bleeding profusely, and had taken him in. Her name was Gabrielle, and she was raising 3 children on her own. Her demeanor made it clear she wasn't happy to see Roxana and wanted her to leave as soon as possible. But Roxana wasn't ready to give up so easily. "Don't you remember saving my life?" she asked, her eyes wide, as though recalling that day. But Morgan shook his head, giving her a blank look. Why torment him? Gabrielle frowned. If he wants to remember, he will. And if he doesn't, then maybe there's nothing worth remembering. She led Roxana to the kitchen for a private conversation so as not to disturb Morgan's rest. "I just wanted him to remember me," Roxana explained quietly. "I searched for him so long, worried that he needed help." "I'll help him, don't worry," Gabrielle assured her. "After all, I found him when he was unconscious." With nothing else to do, Roxana nodded, wished Morgan a speedy recovery, and left the village. She returned empty-handed, realizing that Gabrielle was doing everything she could to endear herself to Morgan so he'd stay with her and her children. He didn't seem to mind and had no desire to return with Roxana to the city, so she had no choice but to leave alone. She decided not to seek him out anymore, to let him live his own life. She wouldn't disturb him again. But the sadness in her heart was so deep that she wanted to scream in despair. She wiped away her tears as she drove, finally realizing she was utterly alone. Her husband had betrayed her, her parents were far away, and the one person who had shown her kindness had forgotten her. "No, I'm not alone," Roxana reminded herself, touching her abdomen and feeling somewhat comforted. She remembered the fortune teller's warning and tried to heed her advice, avoiding the yacht altogether. A few days later, life returned to a calm routine. Despite her friend's advice, she rented her own apartment and began preparing it for the baby. She decided not to tell her husband about the pregnancy until after the divorce, knowing that Donald might try to use it against her, so she didn't want to risk it. She went to work and prepared for the upcoming divorce. Since they shared property, and Donald refused an amicable division, the divorce had to go through the courts. The hearing was scheduled for a few days later. Roxana still sometimes visited the riverbank where Morgan had saved her. Somehow, it brought her peace, as if it were a place of strength. At times, she felt sad thinking of Morgan being far away, but she consoled herself that Gabrielle would take care of him, and he was probably fine there. Just as she spread a blanket and sat down on the sand, she heard a loud male voice nearby. "Roxana." She looked up, startled. The voice belonged to Morgan, she asked in surprise, convinced he'd chosen to stay in the village. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer her question. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her, holding her gently and burying his face in her hair. Roxana placed her hands on his back, realizing just how much she had missed him. She hadn't been able to hug him properly the last time they met. "I remembered everything," he whispered in her ear. "I remembered saving you, all our conversations, and just how much you mean to me." When he pulled back, Roxana noticed a deep warmth in his eyes. "But what about Gabrielle?" she couldn't help but ask. "Gabrielle is a good person," he said. "She helped me a lot, and I'll always be grateful to her for that. But that doesn't change the fact that you're the only one I love." Roxana trembled at this confession. She hadn't expected him to so openly share his feelings, but she couldn't deny how happy it made her. When she had left that village, she was certain she'd lost him forever. And now he was standing right in front of her, close enough to touch. "And I love you too." The words slipped from her lips before she even had time to think them through. But they made Morgan so happy that she knew she had said the right thing. For a moment, she thought about how Gabrielle might feel. It must hurt her deeply that Morgan had left, but Roxana didn't dwell on it for long. Soon, they began living together. It wasn't easy for Roxana to admit that she was carrying her husband's child. She was afraid that learning about this would drive Morgan away. But he stayed. He was far more understanding than she had imagined. "I wanted this baby so much, and I could never bring myself to let go of him," Roxana concluded. "I told you, I love you," Morgan reminded her. "And that means I'll love your child too. I'm sure we'll be a happy family of 3. After those words, Roxana felt even happier. The only thing that cast a shadow over their joy was a news article in the local paper stating that a mother of 3 had recently tried to take her own life. Fortunately, neighbors arrived in time to pull the poor woman from the noose. Roxana's heart sank as she realized it was Gabrielle. She persuaded Morgan to take her to the village so she could talk to her. "I'm so tired," Gabrielle said when they were alone. "Tired of working like a mule just to feed my family, tired of raising 3 kids who never listened to me. Tired of feeling like a bad mother. And the loneliness, no one ever looks at me. I just want to be happy. To finally live instead of just exist." Her heartfelt words brought a pang to Roxana's heart. She realized how deeply unhappy Gabrielle was, clinging to every shred of hope. Roxana placed her hand on Gabrielle's and shared her own story about how her husband had betrayed her. "I wanted to end it all too," she confessed, "and now I understand what a terrible mistake I almost made. Believe me, as long as we're alive, we can solve anything. It's all in our power. And what if I don't have the strength anymore?" Gabrielle whispered. "Then rest, and when you're ready, fight again," Roxana smiled, patting her shoulder. From that day on, Roxana decided never to leave Gabrielle alone again. This woman needed help, and Roxana could offer it. In Gabrielle, she saw herself, not long ago, just as unhappy, exhausted, and broken. But as people say, the rainbow comes after the rain, so a brighter chapter was bound to come for Gabrielle too. Roxana and Morgan began visiting often, spending time with her and her children. It wasn't always easy with the kids, 3 wild boys who were constantly moving, jumping, or breaking something, sometimes all at once. Morgan helped arrange for them to join a sports club so they could burn off their energy there, allowing their mom some peace. Roxana also introduced Gabrielle to her colleague Gordon, who worked in their company's advertising department. She didn't expect anything big to come of it. Her aim was simply to get Gabrielle out of the house and enjoy herself a little. Gabrielle was actually quite pretty. She just needed a good night's sleep to lose that worn-out look and a little grooming to bring out her natural beauty. To Roxana's surprise, the next day, a cheerful and seemingly smitten Gabrielle called her. "After you left, we stayed and talked for ages. Can you believe it?" Gabrielle chirped, making Roxana smile. "Wow. So, what do you think of Gordon?" she asked. "He's so kind, thoughtful, and strong," Gabrielle went on, listing his qualities and making Roxana chuckle with delight. Since then, they started seeing each other more often and soon became a couple. Roxana was happy to see Gabrielle transform into a woman content with her life. Eventually, Gabrielle and Gordon decided to move in together, sparing themselves long commutes. She worried about her 3 sons coming along, but the boys quickly bonded with Gordon, and they only broke one unremarkable vase, which no one missed. Roxana had only one issue left to resolve: her divorce. It didn't sit right with her to live with one man while still carrying another's name. So, she needed to fix that quickly. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. Donald showed up with all his pomp, having prepared well and hired top-notch lawyers. "Don't expect to get anything," he sneered at her in the courtroom. "You'll leave with nothing." Roxana just shook her head, thinking, how fortunate my child won't grow up with a father like him. Donald's character had sunk to such a low level recently, completely disregarding concepts like respect and honor. Donald's mother also appeared in court, once again calling Roxana a thief and threatening to reveal the truth to the judge. "Don't even think about going after my son's property," sneered Magdalene Phillips. Roxana didn't bother reminding her that they had earned that property together. For a long time, Donald's business had only brought losses, so Roxana had purchased many household items herself. But, of course, neither mother nor son cared to remember that. However, neither Donald's rudeness nor his mother's threats could shake Roxana's inner peace. First, she knew she was in the right, and second, she had a man by her side ready to protect her from anything. Morgan had even made sure she had a good lawyer, reaching out to a friend who recommended a reliable attorney who had helped his family many times. "Your Honor, I want everyone to know that my ex-husband," she emphasized the word, "framed me in front of his colleagues and partners, making me look like a kleptomaniac." And why? For his own ambitions. Now, this man is trying to fulfill those ambitions in court by leaving me with nothing. Is that normal? Your Honor, don't listen to her. Donald immediately interrupted. Her words are vile lies to tarnish my name. Believe me, my wife is a sick woman who doesn't understand what she's saying. His response didn't have the effect he hoped for, while her words clearly resonated with the judge. In the end, the property was divided equally, as Roxana had initially intended. News of the court proceedings quickly reached Donald's partners, and some of the most important ones severed business ties with him. "No, we don't wish to work with a man who treats his own wife this way," some said. "We won't collaborate with someone willing to stoop so low for his own ambitions," was the response of others. As a result, Donald's business moved even closer to bankruptcy as his largest partners, who were also his investors, pulled out. A couple of days after the divorce, Roxana married Morgan. They weren't in a rush for nothing. Her rounding belly was visible from certain angles. It was a small wedding, just for close friends and family. Gabrielle and Gordon attended as a new couple. After talking with Morgan, Roxana decided to inform her ex-husband about the child, as it seemed the right thing to do. "And what do you want from me?" Donald asked, in a less than friendly tone. "Nothing, really," his ex-wife replied. "Just wanted you to know. Don't worry about child support, I wasn't planning on asking for it." Donald especially liked that last part, given that his business was struggling badly. As expected, he showed no interest in the fact that Roxana was carrying his child, but perhaps that was for the best. "Do whatever you want." "I don't need him," Donald said dismissively before walking away. However, Magdalene's reaction was quite different. "Will you let me see my grandson or granddaughter sometimes?" the elderly woman asked hesitantly. Of course, Roxana agreed without hesitation, though her ex-mother-in-law still stirred negative feelings in her. "Thank you," Magdalene whispered, and Roxana noticed tears forming in the corners of her eyes. It was surprising, but even the unborn child had softened this otherwise cold woman's heart. She stopped harboring resentment toward her former daughter-in-law and even began calling to check on her well-being. A few days later, Roxana learned the baby's gender. As the fortune teller had predicted, it was a girl, one Roxana had promised to protect. She realized how much her life had changed. If someone had told her a year ago that she would be sitting in a restaurant with friends, a loving man, and expecting a child, she wouldn't have believed it. But now, this was her reality, filled with friendship and love. She looked around at Gabrielle and Gordon, chuckled as she watched the three boys trying to split a pizza, and then turned her gaze to Morgan, who was passionately recounting a sea voyage. In that moment, Roxana understood. She was truly, boundlessly happy.